So I'm going to be presenting some research from one of my graduate students who couldn't make it to this particular meeting. But because I've directed the thesis, I guess I'm allowed to answer questions. This is concerning something that David raised already, which is the introduction of advanced driver assistance systems, sometimes called ADAS, into vehicles. And I bought one recently, had an awful lot of technology in it, some of which seem to work reliably, some a little less reliably. But that's the future, and in almost all new vehicles, since a few years ago, you have the backup cameras required, and almost all the manufacturers are embedding this. But the really important question, and David hinted at this already, is do they make a difference in the driving performance of older adults? And to try to address this, we looked at, that is, Dustin looked at in his doctoral dissertation, driving performance, again, in a simulator environment. So let me just provide some quick background here. We're really in the midst of two striking trends, which I guess everybody is now familiar with. One of them is widespread population aging, and we've seen lots of pictures, and I'm showing you yet another one, this time of world life expectancy between 1960 and 2015. And rapid diffusion of technology like ADAS, which is coming into almost all vehicles. And you can see that life expectancy has increased since 1960. This is world data, as opposed to just developed country data. Has increased from about 52 to nearly 73 years of age, sometimes called the longevity dividend. We can see this play out particularly in the United States. These are fairly recent projections. These are just the numbers of people. And I'll point to two things in this particular slide. One of them is the 65 plus in blue, but in red is the 85 plus. So people like my mother, who just turned 93, my father, who hopefully will turn 95 in May. That part of the population is going to triple between now and roughly 2050. So the oldest old. One of the things we stress in our research projects, particularly CREATE is the Center for Research and Education on Aging and Technology Enhancement. It's a project that's been funded for 20 years now, a series of 5-year fundings by the National Institute on Aging. It's a team of engineers and psychologists who've been working together on design of technology issues. So one of the things we want to point out about aging that has an impact potentially on driving are, and again it's been alluded to, cognitive decline. And age is typically associated with normative, for the most part, negative changes in cognition. And what you can see on the right is CREATE collected data. It's not a representative sample, but a very diverse sample of about 1,200 people on a fairly classic test called the digit symbol substitution test from the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, kind of an IQ-like scale. You can see there's a very strong negative correlation, negative 0.61, between age and performance. You go downhill more or less from the 20s on this task. And the reason I show this particular graph is I'm showing all the data points. And you can see that there are some people in their 70s who are better than 2/3 of young adults. So there's huge variability. In fact, variability tends to increase with age. Now, not everything goes downhill. In fact, in general, knowledge measures tend to rise with age. These are, again, CREATE data using the Shipley vocabulary test. It's known as a crystallized intelligence test. And you can see that there's a modest positive correlation between age and knowledge. Of course, when you're driving, you're making use of both of these classes of abilities. Correlation here about 0.4. The other part of the revolution that I was describing is diffusion of technology. And these are, this is from an old handbook chapter that Sarah Saja and I had a chapter in, just looking at the rates of diffusion of technology. So if you look at the fax machine in 1843, our best estimate is that in the US it was at about 50% adoption in businesses in about 150 years from the invention by Alexander Bain in 1843. It was actually deployed first between two newspapers, Paris and Lyon. The wired telephone was invented in 1876 by Alexander Graham Bell. About 50% adoption in the United States by 1920, 44 years. The microprocessor invented by Intel in 1971, about 50% adoption in households in 30 years. The internet, 1983, TCP/IP networks, 2001, 50% adoption, 18 years. Anybody see a trend here? Rapidly accelerating dissemination of technology. And we'll see the same thing in the automotive sphere. But older adults tend to lag. And this has been known for many, many years. You may remember an early report back in 1995 called Falling Through the Net, NTIA, a US agency, talked about the people who lagged in, it was both telephone and, in this case, computer adoption. And this was a quote: in terms of computers, rural senior citizens, 55 years and older, possess the lowest penetration, 12%, followed by seniors in central cities and the youngest in rural communities. So this has been recognized for a very long time. I'll show you some more recent data trends from the Pew Internet and American Life, which is a wonderful source of statistics on technology use in the United States. And what, again, you can see is back in 2000, this thing outside, I can walk and talk a little bit. There was very, very low, actually it isn't showing too well on this, the graph is cut off. That's at about 12% penetration in 2000 for those 65 plus. And it's up to just about 66% penetration today. A lot of that, these are basically cross sections sequenced over time. And if you were to look at things like the performance of 50 to 64-year-olds, which was at about 43% in 2000, by say 2015, it was up at about 70%. And if you think about it, those people who entered at 43% are now those people who are 65 plus. So whereas there's been improvement, it's not clear that the cohorts are changing. They are changing, but not as much as this figure seems to imply. And you can see this again with US smartphone ownership. These are 2018 data from Pew. And again, you can see that anybody, well, I shouldn't say this, because there's some seniors in the room I don't want to embarrass potentially. But if I look at 18 to 29-year-olds, 94% of them have smartphones today. If I look at 65-year-olds, it's not yet 50%, 46%. So those of you who are designing smartphone apps for seniors, consider the fact that 50%, 1 in 2, won't have a smartphone. These are slightly older Pew data on different types of technology, internet access, broken more finely, this time by age 65 to 69, 70 to 74, 75 to 79, and 80 plus. And you can see steep declines as you get to the oldest old. So in smartphone use, for those people 80 plus, only about a third have a smartphone. Okay, so a framework I found fairly helpful in organizing my thinking about how technology can improve quality of life in older adults. It's what I call the RAS framework: rehabilitate, augment, and substitute. When someone shows up with some sort of a deficit, one of the things you can do is rehabilitate or train the person. Someone's impaired by a stroke, we put them into rehabilitation exercises, say, to improve their reach. The other is to augment a capability, and that's what ADAS does. It supports a failing function. If hearing is failing, provide a hearing aid. If you're having difficulty moving your neck, to check out the left side of your car, beyond your mirror, to see if someone is closing on the left before you pull out, then blind spot detection can be of help. And finally, when a function fails entirely, then you would substitute. So someone who's lost all the hair cells in the cochlea and can't hear, hearing aids aren't going to work. You need a cochlear implant. You need to bypass that field of function. Okay, so one of the challenges, I represent the Institute for Successful Longevity at Florida State. One of the challenges for successful longevity, as lots of other people have already pointed out, is being able to be mobile, particularly driving in North America, which depends so heavily over almost 90% of all trips taken in vehicles. And what you can see is fatal automotive crashes in the US by year. And we're trending after a long drop, mostly because the recession resulted in far less driving in the United States. We're starting to trend back up. Even if you look at it on a proper rate, base rate of 100 million vehicle miles traveled, again, we're trending up. And again, some very recent data based on analysis of the fatal accident reporting system shows that 65-plus-year-olds, this group here, has shown in terms of a 10-year 20% or 30%, depending on the base, 33% increases. Older drivers are increasingly involved in crashes. David's talked about this already, so I'm going to skip through this pretty quickly. I'll just make a couple of points. Being able to detect hazardous situations on the road is a major factor in older adult crash rate. This is where, coming out of Australia, Horswell was one of the first to talk about hazard detection. And in fact, David and many others have argued that ADAS could be one way to keep older drivers more safely on the road for an extended period of time. And there are a number of systems, and I'm going to talk about two of them today that my student looked at: forward collision warning and lane departure warning. Because they can improve hazard detection. They tell you something about whether you're centered on the road for lane departure warning, and forward collision warning tell you whether or not you're closing in on a vehicle too quickly and maybe at risk for a crash. But the problem that Dustin investigated in this particular thesis project was the problems of what happens when you have multiple warning systems in your car. Is that going to be helpful, or if you have multiple, could it become distracting when you have lots of things? I'm going to pass by this a little bit. This is concerning the research that's already been conducted, as David has already mentioned. There hasn't been a lot of research in this particular area. There are a number of studies that looked at things like, we already know, older adults less familiar with technologies, even though they're willing to try them. The most important thing, if we look at technology adoption, and many of the models talk about perceived ease of use and perceived usefulness. Those are the two major factors that control whether someone's willing to adopt technology. And perceived usefulness is the most important. And it's pretty clear that personal vehicle use is important in dependence. There seem to be, in general, the studies that have looked at attitudes of older adults towards in-vehicle technology show that they're valued. One of the studies coming out of our lab that Dustin was involved with, older adults give much higher valuations for a technology like blind spot detection than younger adults. That fits with the data that David showed us about from his most recent study. And the problem, as I mentioned, that we investigated here was looking at whether older adults might be more susceptible to overload or mode confusion when there are multiple warnings present in the vehicle. So these are interim results. We actually, I think, have run the 120th person very recently. I think last week was the last person. It's a 2x2. I'm going to be a little wonky here for people in the general public. 2x2 between subject study design that looked at the presence of forward collision warning, lane departure warning, the two systems combined, and a control with just a smart speedometer present, a heads-up display. I think there was a question about that at the back a little bit ago. So this was about a 30-minute scenario that people went through. So they got a little bit of advanced training first on the system, so it wasn't totally novel. So they were introduced to the two systems and driving in a simulator. And then there were various areas of interest, pullouts, follows, exits, and a critical end situation where a vehicle unexpectedly pulled out in front of the vehicle that they were following, causing the car in front of them to brake suddenly because of that event, and then look at that impact. And we were concerned with, there were a lot of different measures in this particular study. Anyway, so I'll just show you some of the quick results. Headway distance analyses, that everybody's familiar with headway. It was discussed in John's presentation. We were looking at the impact of those factors on things like headway, as well as lane positioning. Just mentioned there were a number of things we looked at as well. Useful field of vision, useful field of view rather, is a fairly classical measure that predicts things like crash frequency for people who have low UFOV. And we also were looking at simulator sickness, which is a byproduct of working in these environments, virtual environments. Turns out both women and older adults particularly tend to be more prone towards simulator sickness. And the other thing we looked at is how representative people considered the simulator driving situation, if they were unfamiliar with it, which most were, and how representative did they feel the scenario, which had a combination of urban and rural driving in it. And these are the results. I'm going to kind of just talk about the significant effects. There's nothing here on headway distance for the case of the forward collision warning, no effect of longitudinal warnings, no effect of having both longitudinal and lateral. And so being in one condition, the other, or both, compared with, say, the control condition, there was no real effect on how much gap, as John discussed gap earlier, how much gap the drivers provided. Part of that was because we had nothing but older drivers in this particular study. They tend to be very cautious, and particularly cautious in the simulator. And so, in fact, although there were triggers built in, they were sometimes so slow, even though we kind of urged them to keep a reasonable speed, they just didn't encounter a lot of collision warnings that had been built into the system. Lane positioning was a different story. Here, there was an impact. So, having the lateral warnings, which tell you as you start to depart from the midway point of the lane, did result in significantly greater headways, significantly closer, positioning relative to the midpoint of the lane. So you can see what happens in control and in the forward collision warning only cases. People were keeping this is the mean absolute value of lane position in meters. Not a lot, about a tenth of a meter, about 3 feet, but still, it shows that it had an impact on driving performance. That was true for lots of the scenarios. The gold and the purple bars here all are lower. So there was also an impact of simulator sickness level, even if you weren't sufficiently inconvenienced that you had to leave the study, just showing a higher rating that is being more uncomfortable in the simulator was related. People tended to drift more. And so that suggests that it's important if you're doing simulator studies to pay attention to the state of the driver there, because that can have an impact on driving performance independently. So that was a covariate. We ruled that out and then looked for the effect beyond that particular effect. So just quickly in summary, lane departure warning did help older drivers to stay significantly closer to the center of their lanes. They drove much more cautiously, too cautiously in the simulator, so we figured that's probably the reason forward collision warning did not generate a safety benefit. They simply had too few of those warnings for them to be modifying things. And as was pointed out in John's study as well, the data he showed a little bit earlier, older adults tend to adopt longer headway anyway. Having both of them didn't show either decreased headway, and didn't result, another measure I didn't talk about here was a workload measure. So workload is one way of trying to ask people how much the current situation they're involved in demanded attentional resources, either in terms of speed of responding or mental effort and so on. These are fairly classical measures. Really didn't show much increased subjective workload. That was the other thing we were concerned with in the study, with respect to having both warning systems active versus a single system. And in general, acceptance attitudes, the other thing we looked at was acceptance, were pretty high. When people were first introduced to this technology, they seemed to be reasonably accepting of it. So the argument is they would certainly be willing to adopt ADAS. So what is the implications from all this? ADAS generally, I think, can be helpful in avoiding the sorts of crashes that occur when people drift out of lanes. We showed a significant effect here. Now again, it was in a simulator, and as people have been pointing out, you really want to see these same effects when people are driving in their own vehicles on the road. So, in terms of that RAS framework, augmentation with ADAS seems quite feasible. And I'm going to suggest something a little bit out on a limb. If further research consistently shows a benefit, but not a cost, in terms of workload and in terms of distraction, then one of the possibilities we may face in the future as these systems improve is the idea of graduated licensing for older adults. Or for older adults who've been identified to be at risk, I can see eventually they're being permitted to drive if and only if they're in vehicles with these types of systems that would render them potentially safe. Much like we have in the United States, graduated licensing for first-time drivers who are typically teenagers. I agree completely, wholeheartedly. I don't know what our UMTRI friends were about to say. We need much more research on finding ways to train people to use these systems, particularly if we can show, as we did here, that there's a benefit. We also need a lot more research on the extent to which ADAS systems stay activated in older vehicles. So we've heard of some cases of people who had them, they got annoyed by the warnings, although, again, a number of studies show older adults are more tolerant about warnings than are younger adults, for instance. But if these systems are there and they're not used, there's no benefit. And potentially, when augmenting ADAS is not sufficient to promote safe mobility as a driver, and David talked about this transitioning to non-driving status, we want to consider substitution within the RAS framework. That's automated vehicles, and in urban settings where it's available, on-demand services such as Uber, Lyft, old-fashioned taxis, and then the variety of other services that people have talked about already in this conference come into play to enable people to have safe mobility.